work or you're finishing your meal, or you're still enjoying your drink, please continue. Then if you want to throw anything away, it's fine too. Again, the rule of 2 feet applies to the afternoon. And we'll have another stretching activity soon as well. So we're going to start with, we've heard a lot of folks talking about digital promise today and pointing over towards Jennifer. So I'm going to start off by introducing Jennifer Cobaker. Jennifer comes to Digital Promise from KIPP LA Schools, a high-performing charter management organization in Los Angeles, where she managed corporate and foundation relationships and led external engagement efforts to ensure the schools and students have the tools they need to succeed. Previously, she worked at 2 Washington, D.C. think tanks, the New American Foundation and Urban Institute, researching and writing about federal education funding, policy, and reform. Jennifer received her master's degree in policy, organizations, and leadership studies from the Stanford Graduate School of Education and graduated with honors from Stanford University with a bachelor's degree in public policy with a focus in education. So if you can join me in welcoming Jennifer.
Thank you, Robert. So Robert also just outed me as another nerd that thinks policy is really interesting, so I appreciate that. Thank you. It is really, really a pleasure to be here in Hazard, despite American Airlines' very best efforts. I actually made it here yesterday. They tried really, really hard, but it is really exciting to hear all of the rich conversations that have happened so far. It occurred to me about halfway through Michelle's presentation that there's perhaps a bit of a lack of foundational knowledge of what this system of micro-credentials is that Digital Promise has put together. And to be clear, the micro-credentials that Gary talked about and that Michelle talked about and that were referenced with respect to KBEC as well are all part of the Digital Promise ecosystem. So all those micro-credentials comply and are part of the world that I'm about to talk about. Yep. It's not. Is it on now? Yes. Oh, that's lovely. Okay. So let's pretend that I was just really, really funny for about 3 consistent minutes. Perfect. So please feel free to jump in, raise a hand, ask a question at any time. I have a tendency to talk quickly, but I will do my best to slow it down to the extent possible. But if I say something that doesn't make sense or needs repeating or what have you, please let me know. All right, so first, why are we doing this? Micro-credentials comes from a fundamental belief that teachers are by definition continuous learners. We know that teachers graduate from their credentialing or certification program knowing a lot of things, but also not knowing a lot of things. And in fact, states and school districts typically require them to continue to learn things through continuing education units, professional development requirements, what have you. Unfortunately, the way that those systems primarily work, and now there are a few exceptions like the system that Michelle talked about earlier, they focus on formal ways that educators learn things. So workshops, in-service days, conferences, things like that. And they focus on the time that an educator takes to learn those things. So literally seat time, how many hours was the teacher's butt in the seat learning the thing, or maybe grading papers in the back of the room. Anything's possible. So micro-credentials come from this belief that neither of those things are very effective. First of all, we know that now more than ever, educators are learning things in informal ways that are available to them thanks to this really cool thing called the internet, as well as this other magical thing that's been happening where teachers are suddenly stepping outside of their classrooms, opening their doors. There's professional learning communities, there's mentoring, there's coaching, there's all sorts of new ways that educators are learning things face-to-face, as well as virtually, synchronously, and asynchronously. And it turns out all of those methods are really valuable ways of learning things. However, our systems, for the most part, aren't set up to recognize them. So micro-credentials first try to recognize learning regardless of where it happens, both in formal and informal settings. And that actually includes my favorite way, trial and error and blood, sweat, and tears in your classroom, because we know that teachers are trying and failing and trying again and failing and then succeeding every day, and they should also be recognized for that. And then second, it also aims to sort of turn seat time on its head, honestly, and look towards competence. So not how long did an educator take to learn something, but can they actually do this thing in their classroom or in their practice? And you'll also note that I'm using the word educator very purposefully. Micro-credentials are not just for classroom teachers, they're for all humans in the school building. So you could imagine there are micro-credentials for classroom teachers. There are also micro-credentials for your media specialist or your librarian or your coaches or your administrators. There's actually, in the state of Texas, I'll talk about this in a little bit, there are micro-credentials for school board members about ethics, if you can imagine such a thing, which is all to say that there are applications of micro-credentials that affect all professionals in a school building, not just teachers. And that's really important that everyone is all in it together. Michelle talked a bit about that as well and the value of that school and district level support too. So in summary, we're addressing two main things. One, recognizing formal and informal learning. Two, turning away from seat time and towards competency. And then three, and this is sort of the bonus, but I think is sort of at the core of what we believe, is that micro-credentials give teachers the power to show someone who they are and what they can do as a professional in their classroom. And this is so powerful because we as a nation constantly have these conversations. We were just talking about this at our table about how the national conversation can really tear teachers down and make them feel like they are not in fact professionals, whereas we know that they really are. And micro-credentials can help be a part of that conversation as well, because it literally, and I think Michelle was talking about like the stickers on their badge. We actually have another classroom where, you know how teachers have like name plates next to their doors, and they're printing out their micro-credentials and putting them, little badge images, on the name plates next to their classroom. So when someone walks down the hall, they literally can see what each teacher knows and is able to do, and that's super cool. So we can be a part of that conversation too. So when we think about what should be in this competency-based system, and so let me quickly define what we mean by competency-based. It's not just that there are competencies that we know that a teacher should do, or know and be able to do, but that we are actually asking the educators to show us that they can do them, right? So it's competency-based in that it's based on this idea that there are these discrete things the teacher can do, but we're also asking the teachers to actually demonstrate their competence in that. So when we think about building the system, we think about it in this nifty little triangle. So first there's the desired outcomes. What are those things that we want teachers to know and be able to do? And we know that they're worth knowing and being able to do because the research tells us they are. So every micro-credential in our system, and there's over 400 at this point, has research behind it that says that this is something that educators should be able to do. So I always make this silly joke. There's no micro-credentials about teaching algebra while standing on one foot because there's no research that says that that's something worth doing. However, there is a micro-credential on wait time, this idea that you ask a question and then wait 5 to 8 seconds, which makes adults feel really, really uncomfortable typically. But there's lots of research that says that this is so important for students because it'll give them time to think, to organize their thoughts, to have conversations with each other, as well as with the teacher. And those are all important parts of learning. So those are the top of the triangle, the desired outcomes, what we want the teachers to know and be able to do. Then there's the multiple ways to learn them. And this, as I said before, there's all of those sometimes good, sometimes not so good, formal ways of learning things, in-service days and conferences and what have you. And then there's these new informal ways, or old informal ways, depending on how you think about it. There's Twitter and YouTube and PLCs and Edmodo and all of the other things out there that educators can be engaging with. And it turns out that all of those, depending on the teacher, can be really valuable, important ways for them to learn things. And we're agnostic as to how that happens. So someone asked Gary the question, and I think Michelle the question about like how much time until they're allowed. The answer is no time at all. It's entirely up to the teacher. There is, by design, no learning requirement associated with applying for or earning a micro-credential. The educator can come from any entry point to applying for and earning that micro-credential. The thing we care the most about is the evidence of the learning. And that's where the micro-credential lives. What is that thing or things that the educator submits to us, or to the issuing organization, I'll talk about that in a second, that shows that they can actually do this thing in practice? And you can imagine that that changes depending on the competency. So wait time is a great example. The only way to know if a teacher can demonstrate wait time, ask a question, and then wait, is to actually see them do it. So the primary piece of evidence for the wait time micro-credential is a video of the teacher teaching in their actual classroom. asking questions, waiting, asking additional questions, et cetera, et cetera. But you can imagine that there are other competencies for which the video wouldn't make any sense. So for example, doing the design thinking process, which is a 6-step research-backed process, the evidence that you'd submit to demonstrate that that happens would be student work, because the best way to know if design thinking and doing actually happen in the classroom would be to see what the students produced as a result of that process. Someone, I think Michelle, maybe you also brought up lesson plans. So often when we work with folks to develop micro-credentials, they say, oh, the teacher will show us that they know how to teach the DBQ. I've just pulled that example out of the air, by sending us their lesson plan on teaching a DBQ, which is a great piece of evidence if you're looking to see if the teacher can plan to teach the DBQ, because a lesson plan is an indication of planning. But to actually see if the teacher can do it, you'd really want something else. I mean, that always, what that evidence is, goes back to the research. So there's lots of research out there that can tell us what that thing is that we need to look at to know if the educator can actually do this in their practice. So the roles. We think of the micro-credentials as an ecosystem, which is a really snazzy word for bringing a lot of people together to create something that is greater than the sum of its parts. And so the roles in our ecosystem are this. First, the issuers. So micro-credentials are fundamentally this partnership between Digital Promise and the organizations with content expertise in the specific area covered by the micro-credentials. So Gary talked about micro-credentials on performance assessment because CCE is awesome at performance assessment. So they are the content experts that developed those micro-credentials on performance assessment. They assess the micro-credential submissions. So if an educator says, I want to earn this CCE micro-credential, they go off, they do the thing, they collect the evidence, they upload it. Someone from CCE assesses that evidence, and then CCE also awards the micro-credential. So there are sort of two steps. One is they look at the evidence against the rubric, and then the other is they actually say, yes, this educator successfully earned the micro-credential, or no, they do not. And that is a really important piece, because ultimately, when Gary awards an educator that CCE micro-credential, he's giving them the currency of the CCE brand as part of that. And so the issuing organization's ownership of that awarding is just as important as all of the other pieces of it. That this is now, people are walking around with your currency. That makes sense. Earners. So these are the educators. And again, it can be an educator of any variety that are actually earning and applying for and successfully earning those micro-credentials. Recognizers, and this is where a lot of the folks in this room come into play, are the states, districts, and other organizations that provide those earners with value for the micro-credentials that they earned. I'm going to talk a lot about what this looks like today with some state examples, as well as some of my big hopes and dreams for what this could mean. I'm also happy to talk about some of the cool districts that are doing innovative things with this as well. But recognizers, this is about that value. How do we take micro-credentials as this cool way to put teachers in the driver's seat of their learning and give them meaningful value for that? We've done some research. We did a nationally representative survey of teachers a couple years ago that found that there's probably about 10 to 15% of educators for whom the sheer intrinsic value of the micro-credential, that recognition, that symbol that says you're really awesome at X, is enough. But to grab the other 85 to 90% of educators, we need that extrinsic value as well. And that's where the recognizers come in. And then finally, technical partners. So Digital Promise has been working with Bloomboard, who is an ed tech startup company since 2015 to develop a micro-credential platform. We also recently launched our own platform as well. So there's different ways that you can come to Digital Promise micro-credentials. There are also some of our issuing organizations that aren't on either of those platforms. The National Education Association, the NEA, is one of those partners. So NEA has their own platform, and they have participated. They're part of the Digital Promise ecosystem. So we work with them to develop every micro-credential. You'll see, so this is an example of a Digital Promise micro-credential. They always have this DP in the bottom left-hand corner. What this means is that micro-credential is part of our ecosystem. It complies with the template and framework that Digital Promise has spent, at this point, years of defining and perfecting. So every micro-credential that has that DP in the bottom left-hand corner, we think of it as like our good housekeeping seal of approval. It has been developed as a result of a partnership between Digital Promise and that issuing organization to be trained on that template and framework, And then my staff actually work with each issuer to develop the microcredential, to vet their research, to support the development of the rubrics and the evidence, et cetera, et cetera. So that is one of the major ways that we have been helping to maintain quality and consistency in the microcredential ecosystem, is through sort of the power of that seal of approval, if you will. All right, so as I mentioned, there is this template and framework. What that means is that every microcredential follows this same sort of outline. So if an educator sees one microcredential and then they look at another one, it should feel comfortable and familiar. They'll know what to expect. It's sort of scaffolded for them. They know what is going to happen to that microcredential. So each microcredential starts with a competency. We think of this as the what. What are we asking the educator to do? So in my example before of wait time, the what that we're asking the educator to do is to demonstrate wait time, to ask a question and then wait 5 to 8 seconds. Then there's the key method, and that's the how. So how does the educator demonstrate the what? For wait time, it's sort of tautological. You demonstrate wait time by asking a question and waiting 5 to 8 seconds. There are other examples where you could imagine that there are multiple research-backed key methods, and this is, again, where that research comes into play. So checking for understanding. There are probably like 40 different ways to check for understanding, maybe. There's exit tickets, there's gestures, there's asking a student to come to the whiteboard, there's asking direct questions. There's so many different ways, and there's research to back up all of those. So you could imagine that there would be multiple microcredentials on wait time, each one capturing a different key method of achieving checking for understanding. The method components goes into further detail about what that key method looks like in practice. So it might give you some suggested approaches or a preparation or reflection, but it will also give you the non-negotiables. So what are the things that the teacher absolutely has to do to implement that specific skill or competency in their classroom? It's important to know, though, that it is our goal with these microcredentials to have them be as accessible to educators as possible. So the vast majority of microcredentials are applicable across content areas, across grade levels, across student ability levels, in some cases across language abilities as well. So we really aim to make them, where relevant and where appropriate, as available to all educators. There are, of course, some microcredentials that are explicitly math content focused, or some microcredentials that are explicitly early literacy focused, or what have you. But for those that are sort of more broadly pedagogically relevant, the goal is to have them be appropriate and available to all educators. Every microcredential also provides the research citations and hopefully links where available that says that this is a skill that an educator should actually do because it has an impact on practice or an impact on student learning, and resources. So Gary mentioned the resources briefly. The resources are not meant to be an exhaustive list of everything an educator should know or go read or go do or what have you to learn a skill, but they're at a minimum a really good starting point. But they're not a guarantee that if you read all of these things, you'll know exactly how to do this. And it does, as Gary suggested, it puts a lot on the educator to take those resources, take their learning, take their understanding, and go and do, or look for additional help, or practice in a PLC. And the PLCs have been repeatedly a really valuable way for educators to work together on microcredentials as well that we've seen. And then we get to the meat of the microcredential. So the submission criteria are, again, the what we're asking an educator to submit. Typically, they start off with some context questions. So what does an assessor need to know about your classroom, about this activity, about what have you, about your students, so they can successfully assess your microcredential. Then it asks you for that core evidence. So that could be videos or Twitter transcripts or blog posts or student work or lesson plans if it's a planning microcredential or whatever it might be. There's the evidence, the types of evidence vary widely based on what that specific competency is. And then there's the rubric. And this, per Gary's comment on transparency, is one of the most important parts, that we want the educator to know what success looks like from the get-go. So they can see that rubric and carry it with them and put it under their pillow at night to know exactly how that microcredential submission is going to be assessed. Assessment. So there were like a million questions about this. I'm going to attempt to address as many of them as possible right now. So when an educator submits their microcredential into the system, so it's an upload into the system, it is then sent to the issuing organization, who assigns an assessor to that submission specifically. That assessor is typically someone either employed or contracted with by that specific issuing organization and has been trained by that issuing organization to assess their micro-credentials. So as Gary suggested before, he and another staff member assessed all 100 plus of those submissions, and they did training and calibration, and so all of our other issuing organizations do that as well. Digital Promise has developed what we call the Assessor Toolkit. I mean, that is a specific tool to enable issuers to get their assessment process to be as scalable as possible. So it provides the guidelines and tools necessary to recruit assessors. So Digital Promise, for example, we contract with educators who are experts in a particular area like deeper learning, because we have a bunch of micro-credentials on deeper learning. So we have contracted with these teachers, so we provide like the job description template that they could use, and then the contract that they could sign, and even the spreadsheets that they could use to track which assessor has assessed how many and how much money they need to pay them at the end of the month. So it's a full soup to nuts toolkit, as well as all of the information they need to establish iterator reliability, to calibrate assessments, and then also to do long-term checks to ensure that assessors haven't drifted in one direction or another. We also have, during assessment, a calibration period. So you'll see here it says free assessment. The first 50 submissions for any micro-credential are free in our system. That means any educator could go to the system, upload their evidence, and submit it completely for free, because that's the calibration period. That's the period during which that issuing organization is determining if the micro-credential is effectively articulated, if the rubric works appropriately. For example, if every submission was passing or failing, there's probably something wrong with your rubric, because you wouldn't really expect those types of outcomes. So that's that period over which the issuing organization determines if there are additional changes that need to be made to their micro-credential. Beyond those first 50 submissions, the issuing organization can then choose to associate an assessment fee with it. The assessment fee is meant to cover the cost of assessment. It's not meant to be a profit-making tool. To be clear, I don't see a world in which micro-credentials become a profit-making tool under any circumstance. So our assessment fees tend to be in the $25 to $40 range at this point. As Gary suggested, I think the CCE micro-credentials are on the higher level of how long it takes to assess a micro-credential. They tend to be in the 20 to 45 minutes per assessment. And that's what we've seen so far across. We have about 40 issuers right now that issue over 400 micro-credentials. We can also talk about passing rates, which I think is a super fascinating little sort of subculture of all of this. In the long term, we've thought about a couple other things. One is peer assessment. There's a lot of research to suggest that educators are awesome at peer assessment. They're really, really, really good at assessing other people's evidence of any variety, particularly with the right training. Our system doesn't allow for this, but that is, at this point, but that is definitely a scalability measure that we're interested in the long term. The other thing, though, that we think has a lot of promise when we talk about local assessment, I can't remember who was talking about that before, but this possibility that a district may want their own coaches or whoever to assess things, that's where we have our assessor certification system. So an issuing organization using that calibration process that they use with their own assessors could certify assessors at the local level to assess on their behalf. And they would then also do these random checks over time to make sure that those local assessors haven't drifted. But then you could imagine in LAUSD, for example, if they want their educators to earn micro-credentials, but they want to handle assessment themselves, an issuer would certify coaches in LAUSD to assess on their behalf. However, it is important that that issuing organization will still have the final say as to whether or not the micro-credential is awarded, because as I mentioned before, there is still that brand power associated with that micro-credential. We want to make sure that that is something that the issuing organizations still feel confident in. So let's talk a bit about passing rates. When we first started doing this, we thought that this would follow sort of like a normal curve of sorts, that maybe like 66% or so of micro-credential submissions would pass out of the gate. Because that's, you know, more or less what you would expect. It turns out that it's more like 52 to 55%, and that varies really widely by micro-credential. So that 52% is across all of our 400 plus micro-credentials in the system overall. We see, though, as Gary mentioned, a lot of resubmission, which is really, really reassuring. About 50% of educators who submit out of the bat will, and do not earn the microcredential, will resubmit. Interestingly, though, we do not see a learning curve on the success rate after resubmission. So no matter how many times an educator resubmits, and we've had educators resubmit as many as 6 times, the success rate of the resubmission is always 50% across the system, which I think is really, really interesting. We do, however, see this constant feedback, that the feedback that they receive in their submission, so when an assessor assesses a microcredential, they complete a rubric. And they also provide comments to the educator about how it could be improved if they do not earn. And we do hear consistently that that feedback is of really high quality, and providing that feedback is actually part of the assessor training process. We have had some issuers who actually create feedback guides. So they provide even like canned feedback based on the type of challenge that the educator is facing to ensure that there's consistency across the feedback that's provided. So that has been a really interesting process thus far. Questions? I'll just pause now because that's a lot of information. Yeah.
Do you hear anecdotally why, perhaps? The people who aren't passing, even with the strong feedback, don't? Sorry, Hi, it's Darcy. Do you hear even anecdotally why those people who aren't passing on resubmission, particularly with strong feedback, why that might be the case?
We haven't heard anecdotally. I have some guesses. So there are cases where districts have made microcredentials mandatory for educators to earn. We generally land, as Michelle said, in this sort of voice and choice world. That microcredentials really should be about empowerment for educators, putting educators in the driver's seat of their professional learning. We see, though, and this is just a hypothesis, that in cases where microcredentials are mandatory, there is likely an incentive for educators to just keep resubmitting while making sort of minor tweaks as opposed to going deeply in. That is just a hypothesis and something that we need to see more of. But I do think there's sort of power in the way the implementation is done and the degree to which an educator has like real incentive to go deeply into a resubmission. Yeah, Gary? I'm sure you have feelings.
Yes, I have feelings. But an interesting thing about that is in our Rhode Island pilot, after we offered a stipend, $500 for anybody who completed. After February, when it had to be done by May, after February, people started to feel as if, oh my gosh, I have to complete this, and that's when they started dropping out, when they felt like they had to complete it. So we didn't offer a stipend the second time.
Yep. Any other questions at this juncture? Obligatory wait time joke here. Yeah.
So what are you noticing even upon the first submissions that are the characteristics of those microcredentials submissions that do not pass the first time?
So there are a few things that we see often. One is technical challenges. Michelle mentioned this, I think, around video submissions and setting permissions. There's probably about 10% of microcredentials that are denied at first because of technical challenges. So that's a pretty sizable chunk. And that, I think, is something that until microcredentials become more commonplace will likely continue. The next is, and this is sort of a bummer, educators who see a microcredential and are like, oh yeah, I do this all the time, and just grab a bunch of evidence and throw it in there, and it's sort of like this spray and pray version of microcredential submission. And those usually, it turns out, you think you're doing design thinking, but you're really not, or whatever it might be. So that is pretty common, that it's clear that the educator was not purposefully undertaking something for the microcredential or didn't fully understand what the microcredential was asking for. One interesting example, we have a set of microcredentials from the Friday Institute on the SAMR model for instructional technology. And we often have educators who think that they're doing like level 4 of SAMR, but they're actually doing level 2. So they just, and there's one microcredential for each level, so they're just applying to the wrong one based on their own misperceptions of what the model is. So we see a bit of that as well. The rest of it really is like the real learning process happening. And that, I think, is the greatest validation of this, is often when we see educators that don't successfully earn, it's because there's something that is easily fixable or addressable in their submission. And that is kind of, there's an ongoing debate in the micro-credential community, if you will, about whether micro-credentials are assessments of learning or assessments for learning. And I think you can make arguments for both a bit. They are, from my view, fundamentally an assessment of learning. However, through the process, and both Gary and Michelle addressed this a bit, they can also be assessments for learning because the educator, by virtue of the feedback and the entire process of the micro-credential, engages in learning themselves as well. Yeah, Cindy. Robert, we need to clone you.
Who was the hand?
Oh, it was Cindy right there.
And then David.
Thanks. You may have addressed this, and I just want to make sure I heard it.
Sure.
My understanding and the work that we've had with you is that all of the credentials are research-based and that it is the responsibility of the candidate to identify the research, do the research, and show how the application fits to the practice that they're pursuing. Is that right?
So you're right in that they're all research-based. The research itself is identified in the micro-credential, and it's made available to the educator. So if they want to go and see the source research, they absolutely can do that. In the application, the educator is not asked to explicitly identify where in the submission you could see the research reflected. However, there is always a sort of direct relation between the research and the evidence that the educator is asked to submit. So that evidence is derived from the research. The other thing that I would address in the research is the grain size question, which also, Gary, to be clear, keeps me up at night among many of the other things you mentioned. And I look very much like the guy in the cartoon, too. Is that the grain size question often comes directly from the research. So we believe wholeheartedly that micro-credentials really should be of different grain sizes depending on the size of the competency. So wait time is like one of the most micro of the micro-credentials. And then something like design thinking is a much larger micro-credential because the skill itself is much larger. So what we do is we go to the research to determine what that right grain size is. The research usually tells you what that sort of unit of analysis, if you will, is of the teacher practice. We also use it sort of like the sniff test. What is the right grain size such that the evidence that the educator is collecting is meaningful, but also not so much that it's burdensome, as well as what is the evidence that the assessor would be assessing that wouldn't take them 12 hours to assess like an entire unit worth of student work or what have you.
Could I do a follow-up then?
Yeah.
Given what you just said, and that some states, some districts are going to scale up very quickly, where is the standards piece to that in terms of digital promise, thinking and doing to guarantee that we can ensure quality as we go?
Sure, absolutely. So a lot of it lives in the Good Housekeeping seal of approval piece. So what our template and framework does is it ensures that micro-credentials comply with what I call 3 pillars. So the first is that it's research-backed, and that is sort of our guiding light in all of this. The second is that it's evidence-based, so the educator has to submit actual evidence of their practice. These aren't assessments of knowledge, they're assessments of ability to do. And third is that they're assessment-based, so a human on the back end assesses against a publicly available rubric. We also do, within that vetting of the research, support in grain size questions. So every micro-credential that you see is the result of that hands-on partnership between the issuing organization and the Digital Promise staff member. Then they also ultimately go through production, including copy editing, et cetera, et cetera. So we have, are trying to provide as much of a guarantee of rigor and quality as possible. I think our success rate really speaks to that rigor, that 52 to 55%, as my CEO said to me regularly, well, no teacher would ever accept that. But the key there is that we are not also providing the learning experience. We do have a hypothesis that if you paired a micro-credential with that professional learning experience directly, you would see increases in those success rates. And we've seen a bit of that. The Friday Institute provided MOOCs on, their first MOOC was on learning differences and different approaches that you can use to work with students with specific learning differences. And they found that educators that participated in the MOOC and then earned the micro-credential had higher rates of success than educators that just applied to the micro-credential without the MOOC. So we do see that met out, that if there was the learning experience integrated, that you would see higher rates of success as well.
David Barnett, retired. Yay. We've heard a lot of discussion about ensuring the quality of the micro-credential. And Michelle kind of responded to this question earlier this morning, but when will we start to get some data about whether it's making a difference or not, both in what the teacher does, but more importantly, the student learning?
Yeah, so I'll be totally honest with you in saying that that conversation makes me fairly nervous for a variety of reasons. One, you could absolutely, so I think of it, it's sort of like Maslow's hierarchy of change, if you will, in micro-credentials. So the first thing that I would expect to see with micro-credentials is a change in teacher practice. So you really want, if the educator earns a micro-credential, you want to see that they not only did it that one time to earn the micro-credential, but they keep doing that thing, whatever it might be, in their practice consistently. The next thing that I would expect to see is a change in teacher perception of professional learning and self-efficacy. So hopefully by virtue of them earning the micro-credential, actually changing their practice, they then suddenly start to see that there are, there's a lot more power in the professional learning they engage in, and they have a greater sense of self-efficacy, themselves. Then you would start to see, and we're starting to see this actually, changes in student engagement. And that's something that's pretty hard to measure unless you're surveying students, which is something that we plan to do, though. Raise your hand if you're a district leader and you love it when people say we want to survey your students. That's what I thought. So then we'd expect to see changes in student perception. So yes, I am more engaged in my classroom because my teacher is doing X. Yes, I'm suddenly more interested in STEM subjects because my teacher is now using this other approach or whatever it might be. And then I think in the long, long term, you start to see an impact on student test scores and other sort of less compelling, as I think Gary would agree, measures of student outcomes. So it makes me really nervous to have this conversation this early because we're really ultimately like 2 years into this. I'd love to have this conversation in 2 to 5 years to think about when we look at a system that has shifted its professional learning wholly towards competency-based in a way that really empowers teachers, can we then see a trickle down to student outcomes? But I think we need to make sure that there's fidelity of implementation before we get that far.
I think there's a little danger in trying to put everything on the back of micro-credentials and say it's going to make the difference.
Totally.
Because micro-credentials is just a vehicle. You still have to drive it.
Yep.
And, you know, I can know the right information and I can have the skill, but that doesn't mean I'm applying it. So it's part of an ecosystem. It's not the system. And I think that's important to remember. Like, I used to have people call me and say, well, if we give this test, you know, do districts who give this test, do their kids do better? And I said, well, if they don't use the results of the test, it won't matter that they ever gave the test. So knowing it and doing it is part of that whole system within the school, that they have to be, you know, like just because you do a PLC doesn't mean you're going to get better. It's how that is monitored and run. So I think it's like this, the MC is just it's a vehicle. It's not,
completely agree.
it's not the whole thing.
Yeah. So it's fantastic that you said that, because the point of my presentation originally was to talk about what systems are being put together right now to facilitate that. And I totally agree. Micro-credentials are a tool. They are not the end-all, be-all, and that the systems that they exist in are what really facilitate them having an impact. And to be completely honest with you, I think this is really about providing competency-based learning and recognition for educators. Micro-credentials happen to be a scalable way of doing that, and a way that uses current technologies to enhance that. But if we took away micro-credentials as the tool, I care wholly and most deeply about the competency-based learning and recognition for educators than about the micro-credentials specifically. So I think we're on the same page.
One comment about, talk about student outcomes. Some of the micro-credentials I've read through actually ask for student, how did this change our practice? How did it change for me in the classroom?
Yeah, so student reflection turns out to be a really powerful piece of the evidence. So I mentioned, I realize now I didn't get to this part, we have the context questions, we have the artifacts, and then we typically ask for both the teacher reflection and, if relevant, a student reflection. And Gary, I think, hinted at this before, that there is intense power in those reflections, more than we ever realized. We very rarely give educators the opportunity to reflect on their practice, and educators react to that very positively when they go through micro-credentials. And even more so, we even more rarely give students the opportunity to reflect on what their teachers do in their classroom. And so the micro-credentials that ask for that have an even greater layer of impact on those practices by virtue of empowering the student in the process. And we also see a couple other things from that. One of our sort of theories of change here is that if educators receive competency-based learning and recognition themselves, they're better suited to provide it to students. The other piece that we see happening anecdotally from educators is that when they incorporate their students into their micro-credential process, the students see their teachers as learners as well. And that, often students think of their teachers as this sort of like infallible, magical being that never has to pee. It turns out when educators are openly engaging in micro-credentials with their students, those teachers suddenly become more vulnerable human learners, and the students participate in that process with them, and that, I think, is super cool. So this is just what's a digital badge, in case folks are not familiar with that concept. Micro-credentials, it's like rectangles and squares, right? All micro-credentials are digital badges, but not all digital badges are micro-credentials. That's really important to know here. So micro-credentials are awarded to an educator in the form of a digital badge. They're specific, so each image corresponds to a specific micro-credential the educator earned. They have all this metadata baked into them. So an educator can upload it into a digital badge compliance system like a lot of LMSs are now, and they can actually view all of that metadata, who they are, who the issuing organization was, what evidence they submitted, et cetera, to earn that micro-credential. They're stackable, so again, they can earn all the micro-credentials within a stack to show a greater commitment to a content area, and they're portable and shareable, and this we think is super cool. That you can take them with you across districts and state lines. You can also share them with your coach or with your colleagues or with your parents or with your students or whatever it is. I mean, they have value in that way as well. So the broader ecosystem, I talked a bit about this. There's a lot of places that micro-credentials exist. These are the first three, so Digital Promise, NEA, and Teaching Matters. Those are all micro-credentials at this point that are part of the Digital Promise ecosystem. They have this DP in the bottom left-hand corner. Bloomboard, our technical partner, also does private programs. That is sort of closed instances where districts or states can have educators engage with micro-credentials. In some cases, the micro-credentials in those closed programs are part of the Digital Promise ecosystem, and in some cases they're not. That is something that a district could design with Bloomboard. There's also lots of local district implementations, a number of which I could not possibly name for you, where districts have created their own badging systems, either that are competency-based or are participation-based. We see that a lot more commonly, and are often facilitated through LMSs, like I think Schoology and Canvas and a couple others now have the ability to award badges, though they may not require the submission of evidence and assessment and things like that. So just to give you a sense of the sort of grandeur of this and where the overlapping circles in the Venn diagram might be. I'm probably way over time, aren't I, Robert? No? Okay. So recognition, this is what I really wanted to talk to you all about. So I mentioned before that the sort of fundamental piece of this is intrinsic. There's great value to that, but we know that for that large percentage of educators, it may not be sufficient to get them really engaged. And that's that 50% of drop-off that we see as well, that the educator really needs to be bought into that system. And then there's also the sharing. So how do I highlight myself as an expert or something in my district, in my school, in my building? We see more and more recognition through compensation. So some districts and states are able to offer salary bumps or stipends. These are probably the least common because they often become complicated with bargaining agreements and things like that. CEUs or PDPs or whatever you call them in your state are probably the most common. That is partially because they're sort of lower hanging fruit, and also because districts are often able to define them themselves. So a district can determine where CEUs come from for their educators. There's a longer term conversation around relicensure or even licensure using micro-credentials. I know Tennessee is sort of dabbling in that in the long-term picture, but it's, I think, a really interesting possibility for micro-credentials. And then my personal sort of favorite potential recognition structure for micro-credentials is career pathways. There's a district in Utah, Juab, that has developed a teacher leader career pathway based on micro-credentials. And the educators that engage in that not only get to become teacher leaders at the end of the pathway, but they also get hefty stipends or salary bumps as well. So there's ways to think outside of the traditional ways that we think about compensating teachers where micro-credentials can be really valuable. CEU approvals, here's a quick map of where we're looking at, or what we're looking at with CEU approvals. And this is sort of an ongoing conversation. There are some places where the CEU approvals are really sort of small for specific pilots, and other places where CEU approvals are open to any educator in the entire state, so it varies pretty widely. All right, so is Jenny here? She was on the list. Jenny from no, I guess not. So AIR, and I think someone referenced this before, did a anecdotal paper of Tennessee, Delaware, and Arkansas to do some sort of initial findings of those state pilots. When they found these 5, I think, really powerful guidelines for implementation. One, decide on your purpose. Michelle talked a lot about this, that if a state is engaging with micro-credentials, you need to know what it is you're trying to address through micro-credentials. Are you trying to address a specific problem of practice? Are you trying to personalize learning? Are you trying to shift towards competency-based? Starting with that purpose will really guide an implementation in a powerful way. 2 is to start small. Michelle talks a lot about this. Pilots are really powerful and important for learning. Wouldn't recommend starting with a whole district or a whole state. Provide choice, but not too much. As I mentioned, we have over 350 to 400 micro-credentials currently available. If you give educators access to all of them, they get overwhelmed really quickly. Educators, research suggests, are really good at knowing where they need help. But if you give them sort of the whole world to choose from, that ends up not being that helpful. But if a district has a really good sense of their own priorities or what the problems of practices might be in their district, you can narrow the number of micro-credentials down. We think probably 15 to 25 is the right space, and then let the educators take it from there. And giving that bounded choice gives educators a lot of good, powerful signposts, but also gives them enough voice and choice. Keep an eye on the score, so it's always helpful to know your success rates and where educators might be struggling. Is a good way to also understand where you can engage professional learning experiences for educators where they may not have them. And one of the things that we see is that micro-credentials are really powerful for what we call emerging 21st century skills. So like STEM and coding and design thinking and computational thinking and MicroCred and all of those things. There's not a lot of access, particularly in rural areas, to high-quality professional learning opportunities there, but micro-credentials can help fill those gaps. And then finally, communicate, communicate, communicate. It is really important, especially when piloting or implementing broadly, for there to be clear ways for educators to communicate with each other, to communicate with people in charge, and also the power of having leadership at the school level bought into pilots or implementations is also really important. I'm happy to provide folks with links to the full paper. It is really interesting and provides a lot more insight into a lot of this stuff. The final thing I wanted to do was sort of run through 4 states to talk through what's happening there in their micro-credential pilots. Robert, do you want me to do that? Okay. So there are, I think I mentioned before, about 9 states that have formal micro-credential pilots of really varying sizes. I'm going to go through not Tennessee because you already got the pleasure of hearing it directly from Michelle, but 4 others in order from sort of oldest to most recent. And I'm happy to answer questions after. I'm going to try to do this relatively quickly. So Arkansas, there's sort of 2 ways that these pilots start. One is through a state RFP, a competitive process where folks apply, and the other is through a pilot that is much smaller and doesn't have a formal competitive process. So the Arkansas micro-credential focused on teacher induction. Their pilot did, and was done through a pilot, so there was no competitive process around it. The content areas specifically focused on new teacher skills, and these were micro-credentials developed by the Arkansas Department of Education. They were not part of the Digital Promise ecosystem, so didn't use our template and framework. The incentive they provided was CEUs, and their primary partner was Bloomboard. So this was one of those private programs that I mentioned before, was done through that system explicitly. Florida. So this is super interesting, I think, because it's one of the first statewide examples where we see career pathways as a possibility for micro-credentials. So this was also a pilot, and it focused on their clinical educator training program. And their two content areas were growth mindset and content conference planning. So how could an educator, as a clinical mentor educator, help develop the growth mindset of their mentee teacher? That's like meta growth mindset, right? And how can they have content planning conferences with them as well? So these were both Digital Promise micro-credentials, the content conference planning and the growth mindset micro-credentials that we developed and assessed for the state of Florida. And the ultimate goal is for these to be part of their broader clinical education training, so it is part of that career pathway. In Texas, so this was something that started in the last school year and is continuing in a much smaller level into this school year. It was originally huge. It was done through a competitive state RFP, and they had 6 different areas that they wanted micro-credentials developed in. Career and technical education, college counselors, school board member ethics, I mentioned that before, I just think it's super fascinating. Early literacy, educators, and a couple other spaces, so it ended up being really broad. There are a lot of content partners that developed each of the micro-credentials. And so Digital Promise worked with each of these content partners to develop the micro-credentials that became part of the private program on Bloomboard for Texas. They provided CEUs to educators that earned them. One of the cautionary tales here is they did their pilot during the summer. Believe me when I say don't do a pilot during the summer. Teachers don't want to do stuff during the summer. Don't do it. Moving forward, I believe their ongoing focus is going to be on classroom management using the Teach Like a Champion micro-credentials. So that is sort of ongoing work happening in Texas based on the learnings that they had from their first year. And then finally, Louisiana. This is the newest, super interesting. So it was a state RFP, but it was not a state RFP that was explicitly focused on micro-credentials. It was a state RFP that wanted to develop an educator distinction process. So essentially, how could they create a process for educators to get awards, more or less, for becoming either content leaders or mentor teachers? So they would go through a specific online virtual training process, and then they wanted a test or something of some kind to then designate those educators as content leaders or mentor teachers in math, ELA, or general ed in both elementary and secondary. So this was kind of a huge in scope. They had content partners, so that was the UT Dana Center and School Kit, with support from Learning Forward and Teaching Lab. And their ultimate thinking is that this may start as CEUs, but then might even become part of licensure or a career pathway. So could you become a mentor teacher and then scaffold up more micro-credentials to become a principal, for example? So a lot of really interesting things happening in Louisiana as well around this, though they sort of accidentally happened into micro-credentials. And then that's actually it. As I mentioned before, Digital Promise has our own micro-credential platform. It is open to all educators, so anyone can go in and look at all of the micro-credentials, start an account. Micro-credentials that are beyond that calibration period do have an assessment fee associated with them, but the vast majority of them are still free for educators to earn. This is a great way, and we always say this to folks, like, just try it out. You know, if you have a couple teachers that are willing to go above and beyond, they can get in there and start applying and earning, and it's very low risk. Always happy to have longer conversations around formal work or answer further questions. My email is super easy to remember, jennifer@digitalpromise.org. Thank you all so much.
Thank you, Jennifer. And Jennifer, Jenny DeMonte, she is in your packet. If you want to reach out to her, she is working on some research for micro-credentials. An issue happened that prohibited her attendance, but she would love to hear from you. Trust me, she would. Okay, our next thing coming up is, here we go. If you wouldn't mind standing up again as we get ready to transition into our panel discussion. We've had lunch. We've heard a great presentation. So looking at the video, you do see what you're going to end up doing. So here we go.
Turn your body to the side and stretch your arms out long like Maximo the monkey surfer. Yes. Bend your front knee so it is directly over.
This is what comes up. This will go way up there. I guess I can just sit up for 2 minutes. Yeah,
Keep
sit
your
for 2
body
minutes. So that's
facing
what'll be
to
on
the
the
side.
screen. All right, so
Beautiful face. It should face Maximo.
And you don't have to be said over and over.
Ah, yes. You
just kind of notify me when.
riding the waves. Smell that salty air. Breathe it in deeply.
This is the first time I've ever seen.
Breathe out. Maximo thinks you are like big kahunas on this earth. How you say, hang 10, my friends. Now, look behind you at your hand and slide it down to your thigh or calf, like Maximo. Keep your front knee bent. Bring your other arm up over your head. Yes. Look up at your hand as high in the sky and breathe. You are doing it. It's very, very tricky. You are a champion. Feel the waves of happiness as they wash over your surfer body. Now release this pose and bring your hands and feet together as you face Maximo. Aloha! Maximo is happy to see you again. Breathe in. Breathe out. Feel light, like you're floating on waves of understanding. Oh, yes. Now are you ready to take on the second side, surfer dudes?
All right. You guys are such great sports with that, but it does feel pretty good, doesn't it, to get that out. So if we can get our panelists to come on forward.
That's what I'm doing right now. I've got it. I'm just going to make this sit. No. Stop. Reset.
Right?
Yeah, I think it's 1 a.m.
How's this work? Oh, nailed it.
Okay, we're going to go ahead and begin with our panelist discussion. And we've heard some great presentations today from our morning with Matt Dunleavy, with Michelle Mills, Gary Chapin, and then Jennifer Cobacher. And listening to all that at that level is wonderful. And we can get excited and think, how can I implement that in what I'm doing? But what's even more exciting is when you hear from those who are working at the ground level with their students, knowing what the students need, developing professional learning plans for educators, and then moving forward with that work. Now, I want to compliment these folks for coming today because today is also school testing day, so students are busy with assessments, and they've given time from their assessment time, so thank you for that, to drive up here to share with you some
Experiences. Leading the panel conversation today is our moderator from Kentucky Valley Education Cooperative, Bernadette Carpenter, who's one of our instructional leads. And I was going to tell a joke about Bernadette, because at first we had everyone on a table level, and I was going to ask Bernadette to stand up. But now, since everyone's very high, it almost seems mean to say that, doesn't it? So I'm not going to pick on you. So I will just not say anything. But I'm very excited about Bernadette. Jeff Hawkins is our director of KVEC, and he leads us. But we all work for Bernadette. You ever had a meeting? I mean, I hear this quite a bit. Now, no, that's Bernadette. So I will turn it over now to you.
I don't.
So, and there are mics on the tables for you for you guys to share as we go through. So Bernadette will be asking the questions, and then Tanner does have a timer set for each of these, so we can keep on time. But we want to make this, we have questions for the panelists, but as always, I want you to ask questions of the panelists as well, because they're ready and they're excited. Bernadette.
Okay, I'm ready. Am I on? I'm so loud anyway, it's kind of hard to tell. Okay, the first thing we want to do is welcome our panelists. Thank you guys so much for taking time out to come and be with us and to answer some questions for us. I'm gonna introduce you. We have Rachel Frider. She's from Floyd County, Allen Elementary. Sarah Bowen, Paulsburg Elementary in Lawrence County. We have Anna Prince, and she's from Louisa East. I always get that confused. So Louisa East in Lawrence County. We have Angela Duncan. She's from Floyd County, and she is the Director of District-Wide Services. We have Danielle Duncan. She's a teacher at Redwood County High School. And not Tim Bobrowski, but we have Tina, his wife. So I told her, I said, I think I can take a marker and fix that if you want me to. But we're really glad to have you guys here, and we appreciate you offering to do this or volunteering or being voluntold, whichever the case may be. Now, what we're going to do is take 2 minutes per question. And at the end, I'm going to ask, as we go through this, when you have questions, just jot those down, because we're going to have 15 minutes at the end of their questions for anybody that wants to ask questions. So just hang on to your questions, but write them down. All right. I think I'm going to start with, No pressure. And what we will do is we do this, we'll just go on to the next fella and they'll answer also. How has micro-credential completion impacted the instructional behavior in your classrooms?
What I bring to the panel today is a look into the future, and we're really excited about it. I am in a K-8 elementary school, and I am in our second year. Can you hear me? I've got the teacher voice. I don't need the mic.
We're live.
Are we live?
We're live stream. You have to use my
Oh,
mic.
sorry.
Thank you.
On?
Just pass it on, Cheryl.
Okay. Go for it. Test. Can you get them on now?
2 minutes, 2 minutes.
Okay. Great. What I can bring to the panel today is a look into the future at our school. I'm in our second year as an ACT school with KVEC, and we've been focusing on student engagement. And we are organizing ourselves in our school, in my school, into learning teams. And we're going to be completing the micro-credential for learner engagement in PLC level teams. So we're going to have a kindergarten team, a first grade team, second, all the way up until 8th grade. So our teachers are going to be actively working together to complete this micro-credential. It's individualized personal learning that's suited to the need that we have in our school at this time. We're a high-performing school, but we still have some students that are not performing out of the novice apprentice levels. And we were saying, what can we do about that? How can we improve our practice? We know, through our data analysis, that student engagement is going to bring higher levels of student performance. And we want to do active learning in that. You know, we don't want to go to a PD to where we have to sit and listen and maybe take some strategies or some website home. We want hands-on experiences, and our teachers are excited. They've got that growth mindset. We're kind of in the mind frame that yeah, the college credit is great, but we want to evolve our school. We want to improve our schools, so we're looking at it through the lens of a professional development. You know, we want to earn those badges, and we want to, you know, to get everything that comes with it. But we're really looking at it through a professional development. I'm going to have some conversations with our district leads.
You can go ahead and finish.
Our district leads about how we're going to put it toward our 24 hours of professional development. But that's where we are. We're a lens into the future, and we are over the moon about it.
Okay, Sarah, can you ask?
Same question?
Yes, please.
I'm also a principal of a preschool through 8th grade school, and this past year, and I'm also involved with this through the ACT, with KVEC, and this past year was kind of, I addressed it kind of like a buy-in for my teachers, because we did have an incentive. I was able to give teachers $100 per micro-credential, so we have 5 micro-credentials that were completed, 3 more in progress, and I also completed one myself, the framing the problem of practice for our school. And so really this year was just kind of a buy-in, but some of the things that we did see that kind of changed instruction was like based on walkthrough data. You know, I had one teacher that was struggling with questioning, and so that was part of her PGP, her professional growth plan, was to increase that. So I kind of linked her up with that problem of practice, and she was able to complete a micro-credential, and based on walkthrough data, each time I was in her classroom, it improved each time. So I think that, you know, that had a lot to do with her participating with that micro-credential. But we've done micro-credentials on formative assessment, communication with parents, formative assessment, I said that collaborative learning within classrooms, so we've kind of covered a lot of different bases. Oh, I've still got 37 seconds.
Can you clarify what ACT is for the group that?
It is kind of like a group that we had to fill out an application, and we were accepted. 14 schools, was it 14 schools, Jennifer, last year? Activating catalytic transformation. So we had, thanks for putting me on the spot. So we had to choose a problem of practice that we wanted to focus on in our school, and with that, we've worked on different components, networking, bringing different resources in, and so actually all 3 of us, we got it again for this coming school year, so we're excited.
Very good. Okay, Anna.
Same question.
Same question.
Okay. I'm also part of the ACT initiative, and with that, this year, we chose to allow teachers the autonomy to participate in the micro-credentials. I just sent out a mass email and asked teachers to meet with me and go through what the micro-credentials would look like. At first, I had about 12 teachers out of 24 that wanted to participate, and so far I've only had 2 complete those. One teacher went above and beyond, and I turned in her stipend state reimbursement. She completed 3. What I found with her, she's a high-performing teacher. She does very well in the classroom, and a lot of times in PD we find that teachers are at different varied levels, and you've got your new teachers who need a lot more professional development from the groundwork, just to kind of build them up. But the teacher like Mrs. Kingsmore, she went above and beyond, and this was able to allow her to look at areas that she felt she needed professional growth, and she worked on things such as using formative assessments in the classroom. She also has redesigned her classroom this year and worked with flexible seating and collaborative learning with her students, and communicating with parents. So she gathered data on these things, and she successfully completed 3 micro-credentials this year.
Are you seeing that others are wanting to do it more since, you know?
I think so. This year, like I said, we were trying to do it more for buy-in, and once teachers completed those, they talked about how easy it was. There's a lot of things that they're already doing, and confirmation that they're doing it well. The video is kind of scary for a lot of them, but I've implemented that in different ways throughout the building and trying to get them comfortable with seeing themselves on video throughout the year.
Thank you very much. Miss Angela.
My primary role for the last 2 years in the Floyd County Schools has been developing a systemic approach to supporting teachers toward accomplished teaching practices and standards. And we've had the opportunity to participate in a national grant called the Network for Transforming Teaching and Learning. And so the initiative in our district that we put a lot of emphasis on was building teacher leader cohorts, so that we were developing teacher leaders who could give us feedback to what they needed, but also to support early career teachers. We were seeing a high turnover of teachers, and we were also having some critical shortage areas where we were having teachers who were coming to our classrooms from non-traditional routes. We had several Teach for America employees. We had some teachers who went through an alternative master's program, and we really wanted to give them the support early on to make sure that we were recruiting teachers and that they were feeling successful from the beginning. So early on, I learned about the micro-credentialing process, and we focused specifically on the collaborative coaching piece. We wanted to make sure that our teachers who were involved in mentoring new teachers felt comfortable facilitating adult learning, having conversations that were beneficial and not evaluative or critical from a peer. So we took the voluntary approach also, and it was offered to our teacher mentor group. Any of those teachers who wanted additional training in collaborative coaching. And we had 3 last year who took on the challenge and passed their micro-credentials in collaborative coaching. And I just feel that that's given them more credibility as a mentor within our district, and we are seeing additional teachers who are wanting to take that route for the next year and obtain that credential. Because it wasn't not specifically an instructional content in their micro-credentials, the impact in the classroom that I have observed is that their classrooms became much more student-centered because they had the experience of a project-based competency experience, and I was seeing that replicated in their classrooms. I felt they were becoming much more innovative, and I was seeing that the teachers were becoming much more reflective and collaborative with their peers.
I also came to micro-credentialing through the ACT initiative that KVEC has implemented. And as a teacher, I teach 8th grade English Language Arts. This for me was really beneficial because it forces me to self-assess myself. And I feel like that's something I struggle with, going back to what was said about the videoing yourself. I think most of us can agree that that's not the greatest thing, like to sit down and watch a video of yourself teaching. So it would be really easy for me to go in and pick all the micro-credentials that I'm really good at and do those, but I don't feel like I would get the same benefit from them as I would finding something that I struggle in. So for me, that has been really helpful. We started, as part of the ACT team, we did the one on the problem of practice, which I actually found really helpful, like applying it to my classroom, figuring out, like analyzing data, figuring out where I see areas of growth, and then coming up with a logistical plan to like solve those problems. So for me, like seeing the ones that don't necessarily apply right to teachers are very easily transferred to the classroom. I'm not sure what else to say about that, I still got time left. I guess the other big thing is having the chance to start it from the beginning. It's been really cool for me to go in and talk to other teachers in my district and my building about what micro-credentialing is and giving them that perspective of another teacher. It's not just someone telling you, you need to go do this, but I can speak from experience to how and why it was beneficial for me. So I think that's how it's impacted the instructional behaviors in my classroom.
I am English and Spanish and media specialist, and in Owsley County, we are in our 2nd year of micro-credentialing. We do a pretty generous stipend at the moment for getting those micro-credentials. The first year we had how many complete? 62, I think, so very successful in that respect. Fewer this year. Next year, in our 3rd year, those micro-credentials will be required. Everyone will be required to do one. So that will be branching out and adding to our learning communities, professional learning communities, and learning cadres. Like this year, we got learning cadre assessments, so I assume our micro-credentials will be, something similar. I have one micro-credential, and I knew what that was until I sat down here and looked at all of these eyes at a camera. So don't ask which one that is now. I'm currently working on another. I am in that 48% that gets to resubmit. So I am persistent, but learning that there are 50% who don't get it. I might be persistently a failure. It does make you self-reflect. We ask our students to be competency-based, to illustrate to us that they are competent in a skill. We don't always ask ourselves to do that. And I'm going to tell you, it's different. It makes you much more aware of what is involved. As a teacher, I think it makes some of your newer teachers, and even sometimes some of your older teachers, recognize the importance of that rubric, that knowing up front that this is the criteria. These are the resources that you need to get to that criteria. And hey guys, I'm doing the same sort of thing. I'm working on this my own self. And so it builds a little bit of camaraderie there also when the students are working with you. They recognize, hey, she's a learner just like we are. And we are lifelong. We are lifelong learners.
Great. Thank you. Okay, anyone have anything else to add? Okay, our next question is, by what means are teachers sharing the success of the new learning? And Danielle shared a little bit of that. We'll start with Danielle and let her lead off.
Awesome. All right. So in my district, it's been very slow going, primarily because my middle school is currently in the process of merging with my high school, so we've had a lot of stuff on our plate. But we've been focusing on this, especially through the ACT team. And one of the first things we did is all 4 members of our core team got the micro-credential, like I said earlier, for the problem of practice. Then my high school counterpart, Emily, worked with the math team at the high school to work on one, and I'm not sure the name of it, but I know it was based upon like analyzing how you spend your time in the classroom. And they all did that one. And she got some really good feedback from them. Last week, actually, we went, a group of about 8 of us went down to Atlanta to visit and observe Ron Clark. And on the drive down, Emily and I tried to sell micro-credentials to the rest of the people in the car and gave them some information about it. I think one was a bit more interested than the other, but we got one of them interested in doing one for the math team. So we're kind of expanding there. And actually next week, Emily and I are going to be leading all of the non-tenured teachers at the high school in the completion of a micro-credential on Wednesday afternoon. And I think one of the biggest things for us was finding that it's easier when you start off with groups, because everybody's doing the same thing, although they're doing it on their own. They have that support instead of just looking at the micro-credential and going, oh my God, like I have to do all of this, and freaking out about it. So having that support system has been really beneficial for us in our slow but ongoing plan to get more and more people involved in the process.
So recognition for micro-credentials in our district. The first year we did them, it was actually really neat as a teacher. You were recognized at board meeting. And so you got a nice certificate and you got your stipend at the board meeting. Because micro-credentials aren't easy. They're very, very similar, I think, to some of the sections of national board certifications. I actually proofread a lot of those for our teachers who are doing those. And so when I was doing mine, I was sending mine down to her to proofread mine. She's like, this looks so similar. And then we got nice certificates to place outside, somebody mentioned that, outside your classroom door. Badges, so we had those, they were printed up, laminated, and we're hanging them. So it's really nice to go down the hall and to see those. So there's a little bit of pride there in knowing that you completed something. And I just totally lost my train of thought.
It's okay, I do it all the time.
I think I'm finished now.
Okay, we'll move on to Angela, and then if you think of it, we'll come back.
I think we have a very similar experience in our district. Primarily, the teachers who have completed it and found value in it have shared that with their colleagues and have encouraged them to go through the process as well. So that's what we're seeing. We are seeing some discussion at school level PLCs, and we do have plans for opportunity for this cohort of teacher mentors to have opportunity to work together as a group and have some discussion on moving forward with additional micro-credentials and seeing if we can get the majority of them to embark on this. I didn't mention earlier, but we have paid a stipend also for the teachers to complete these.
Just out of curiosity, how did you all fund the stipend,
In our district, as I mentioned, we were part of the Network for Teaching and Learning grant, and so we had some funds available to do that. We also used Title IIA monies for teacher development.
Great. Tina, how'd you all?
In our district, Tim paid them out of his pocket.
Wow, okay.
Wow.
Okay, Anna?
Our teachers are sharing their success through, or during PLC time. We have teacher leaders who come and present things that they're using working in their classrooms. We also have teacher leaders who lead the PD days. We most recently had a really successful reading PD where teachers share strategies that they've used in their classroom and see success and growth in indexes on student assessments. I mentioned before using videos. That seems like the easiest method of sharing through Google Drive. We'll upload a video of a teacher using a specific strategy, and if we have another one who is struggling, we can share that with them easily. It seems to be easier than finding coverage for those to go and actually see them in person. But we also do offer some time for teachers to have peer coaching or peer mentoring where they can visit classrooms and see firsthand what's going on in those rooms. And we offered stipends through the KVEC grant also. We had $1,000.
Okay, great.
And I think the big thing that we have done to show success is really just to celebrate the teachers that, you know, have the guts to, you know, be the guinea pigs to try the micro-credentials this year. Of course, I shared it on Twitter and tweeted it all over the place, and that shows up on the school page. So it also kind of lets parents see, even on our Facebook page, that, hey, our teachers are trying to improve every day. And so I think that's good even for the community piece of it. And of course, PLCs and classroom visits. And then also I have 2 teachers that we have a Google Drive, a team drive that we share with everybody. So my teachers are allowed to put things on there that they would like to share, and I have to approve it. But when I approve it, then that kind of goes out as to all of my staff in my school, so they're able to see the things that they've implemented based on micro-credentials.
Good ideas. Great.
Thinking about teachers sharing success of what they're learning, I see this ongoing in my school next year. We have a school where sharing is very, very, it's common. Teachers have opportunities each 9 weeks. We do a peer review utilizing our district walkthrough document, and teachers will go into a colleague's classroom, and they'll actually get feedback from the teaching and the engagement that they see going on. So I see this learning coming into play there as they're completing this micro-credential on learner engagement. So the peer reviews is an amazing way for them to share. They come to PLC, they're ready to talk about great things and things that they see in our building and things that they want to apply to their practice. So that would be an amazing way to share the learning. I meet with each PLC grade level once a week. So a lot of our PLCs next year are going to be around the micro-credential work. You know, where are we? We're going to have a timeline. Where are we? What do we learn? What are the impact that we're seeing? So we're going to be doing a lot of progress monitoring and sharing throughout the process. Faculty meetings, portions of our faculty meetings will be set aside for the learner engagement micro-credentialing work, you know, where we'll have grade levels present, learning, share. One of the things that we do at faculty meetings is, you know, we always start with what's great about being at our school and what great things are, what are we doing for kids that are amazing. And teachers will stand up and they're required, they'll stand up and say, you know, I shared this with this classroom. And, you know, because I'm constantly having them share their learning. What can you share? You know, we've got rock stars in our building. You know, we've got teachers that are at all different levels. And if we get that network of sharing, it's going to go amazing with this work. And so have them stand up and talk about, report out. So I'm so excited about next year. I can't wait to get started. And I think it's going to be an awesome, and just teachers having that validation of being able to share and speak their minds and say, this is what I'm doing and this is what I've applied to my practice is powerful in itself.
It is, very much so, very much so. Okay, how has this new learning experience through micro-credentialing made a positive impact on your students? Because that's what it's really all about, is what is it going to do for our kids? So let's start with Anna.
We have seen a lot of student impact based on their most recent MAP scores. The teacher who reported the most or turned in her most micro-credentials, she had great gains of those students in their MAP assessments and other assessments throughout the year in reading. She's a reading ELA teacher. We also
have had teachers to take initiative to try these new strategies just based on her learning. She shared those with others and has been a good mentor for a new teacher that we have this year who she also helped with KTIP. She also talked about it caused her to reflect on practices of communicating with parents. And that's something that we find in our area, that we have a lot of students who kind of fall between the cracks because of the lack of communications with their homes. She has already made plans next year to go a step further and track her data and see if, make sure she makes positive connections with those parents weekly for each student she has in her class.
Okay, let's go on to Angela. As I shared, we have focused specifically on teacher mentoring with the collaborative coaching microcredential. However, I do feel that teachers have improved their feedback with their students based upon receiving that collaborative coaching training. I also feel that our teachers have shared the vulnerability with their students, that they were actually going through a process very similar to what they were doing. And so I think that really has opened a dialogue in our classrooms. 2 of the 3 teachers that were involved in the microcredentialing are actually involved in the Summit Learning Platform, piloting that program for us. So the students were experiencing something very new this year also, and I really think that opened the dialogue to the relevance that we all need to be applying what we're learning, and it's okay to learn in different means and different manners, and that it's okay for everyone to sometimes experience failure for the first time, and that there's a lot of learning to be said in that and trying new things. So I think really we saw some cultural impact in our classrooms because our teachers were willing to try something new.
I agree. It's okay to fail. Sometimes you learn more from that than anything.
I think my answer to this is twofold. If you have ever taught middle schoolers, you probably know that when they want to know something, they will turn into Sherlock Holmes and they will find out everything they can. So when I'm out for a meeting here at KVEC or elsewhere, I don't know how they do it, but I come back and they'll ask me about my meeting and they'll know all the details, and I do not understand how. But for me, I think that's the thing that really appeals to the kids, is that I'm also a student learner in terms of micro-credentials. So I tell them about what I'm working on, I tell them about my meetings, and I talk about it in terms of learning, and I frame it in terms of like homework and things like that. And I feel like that really builds a connection between us, because as it's been said many times here, they see that I'm still learning too. So it kind of puts us on equal footing there. Aside from that, I think the other big thing is that it allows me to change my practices. There's one that I haven't done yet, but I'd like to do, and it's on wait time. I am terrible with that. Like, I will ask them a question, and 5 seconds later, I'll be like, anybody? Anybody? And I'm really bad about that. And for me, knowing that that's something I can improve on, I think will benefit my students, because as I learn and I make these changes in the classroom, we can determine which changes are good, which changes are bad. And beyond that, every class has their own personality. So a change I make to my first period may not go over as well with my third. So this gives me the opportunity to try new things and grow in the things that I maybe am not as strong as. So I think that's really the big benefit there for the kids.
Well, I'll speak personally to the one that I've been working on. I'm still working on it. Goal setting. So I teach 9th and 10th graders. It was my assumption in the beginning that 9th and 10th graders, having been in school 9 and 10 years, knew how to set personal learning goals for themselves. And there were particular skills that we needed to work on. There were things that needed to be done. But in meeting with those students, the goals that they gave me were, I'm going to get a better grade. That's my goal. How are we going to get to that goal? I'm going to do better. Quantify better. So it actually led, my working on that goal setting actually led to teaching them how to set SMART goals. I'm going to complete one level at 80% accuracy. Much better than I'm going to do better. Much more easy to track. Or I'm going to improve to 70% accuracy in the completion of 5 assignments. Something that we could actually work with and actually measure. And then we took that and turned it into something visual for them. And we actually did pencil and paper. We made the nice stair-step charts. I started at 60% accuracy. It's now week 3, I'm at 82% accuracy. Something that they could visually see and represent. So it was a learning process, not just for me, but for them as well, when we were doing those things together. And so that was quite valuable, and that impacted my practice. I don't make that assumption now. I don't assume that when you walk in and I ask you to set a goal, that you've written something down there that we can actually measure when I talk to you tomorrow. So we back up and we start with, this has to be something that we can measure with a number. This has to be something that we can measure with time, how long from now. And so that was a learning process there for me.
Sounds great. Well, it's Sarah.
This year, for positive impact on students, the micro-credentials that my teachers completed were based on instruction and improving classroom instruction. So I think anytime that you are focusing on improving instruction, you're going to have positive impacts. And it also allowed myself and my teachers to dig into data a little differently. Like I know when we were doing the framing the problem of practice, I wasn't just looking at common assessment data, I was looking at different types of data. So when I went through like the walkthrough data, for instance, I noticed that formative assessments were a weak area across the board. So that was what my problem in practice was that year, was formative assessments and trying to increase that in my classrooms. So teachers were able to look at that and not even look at the data, but it's low, now what? We have this problem, now what are we going to do? So anytime that we're able to do that and improve instruction and take action for it, then you're going to have positive impacts throughout the building. And throughout just not even the teachers that did the micro-credentials, but throughout your building. I think so. I think I've got one that that is really big on reflections, and she has backed her data up with observations that she has saw within the classroom.
Rachel? I will actually be going, I'll be an active member of our teams, and everything that we do, we want to impact positively, obviously, student learning. And one thing that comes to mind that we will utilize very much next year as we're going through the process and we're completing the micro-credential on learner engagement is our walkthrough document. Component 11 in our district is very strategic, and it talks about student engagement. So that's an opportunity for me to give feedback to every team member weekly in our building. And we'll be able to see, is this positive, are we seeing positive things? Are we seeing changes in the classroom? So the walkthrough document is going to be huge in seeing how that's going to impact success. We do 3 benchmarks a year. So, and we're going to be active implementers during this process. We're going to be taking this learning to our classrooms as teams. What's working, building sharing. So the walkthrough document, component 11, is going to be really big for giving, seeing the positive impact, benchmark testing, formative and summative assessments, and just the sharing in the building. Teachers have a vibe when things go well or things that don't go well. So a lot of sharing, our walkthrough document, and assessments.
Okay, great. Now, we have a couple more questions, but because we're kind of low on time, we want to make sure the audience gets to ask the questions that they'd like to ask. So would anyone like to ask a question?
Sorry, guys. This is for the superintendent. I heard from you, I believe, that the superintendent paid, are you the superintendent?
Yes.
That you paid out of pocket for folks to do this. What was your motivation? That's a heck of a commitment.
Well, to be honest with you, I felt like that it was kind of, if I'm pushing this initiative, that I felt like that if teachers saw how committed I was to it, then they would believe more in the process. And I kind of felt like it was, of course, we're a very small rural district, so our funds are very limited, but I felt it was the right thing to do, to try to get our teachers to believe in the process, and also let them understand that if I believe in it and I think you can do it, I'm going to support you in this area.
Do you think it's paying off?
I think you see a lot of teachers, I think you see a lot of folks that are within the district who now have moved to another level of accomplishment, where they are not afraid to try new things. And that was, again, part of the motivation, right? Don't be afraid to fail, but try.
So who was the person that said, you, Tina?
Did I say
That he was paying out of pocket, right?
Yeah, he contributes to a teacher incentive fund. And from that teacher incentive fund is where we pull things like this that nothing else covers. But
So-
ultimately, he puts into the teacher incentive.
So
fund
you know his
something.
motivation, how did that motivate you all to know that he had that commitment?
He's gonna pay us something to do this. Wow, this is something, I'm gonna do this, you know. Yeah.
Congratulations and thank you.
Another question? Raise your hand if you have a question. I can go ahead? Okay. I'm going to go ahead and ask the other questions. That's what I'm going to do. All right. How does the micro-credential learning process compare to other professional learning experiences that you or your school/district has completed? So Rachel, just start.
Wow, that is, it's interesting because it's a different way to learn. It is hands-on, it's individualized and personalized for what your school needs. As an administrator, I can see into all the classrooms at my school, and I can see, we're all going to focus through ACT on learner engagement, absolutely, but it opens up a world of other possibilities. If I see a teacher struggling with management, questioning, it's personalized learning that you go through for a process. It's not going to a meeting and getting a few websites or a few books, which is important, but we all know that we can struggle in implementation. When you're doing a micro-credential, you're invested. You're invested in your learning, and therefore you're going to evolve, and your practice is going to evolve. So it is personalized, hands-on learning with opportunities to meet basically any need that your school may have.
Very good. Sarah?
I think the big thing with this is, we as principals, we ask our teachers differentiate with our students. So I think it's our job as administrators to make sure that we demonstrate that for our teachers as well. We have teachers, I think Ms. Prince talked about, that first year teachers to veteran teachers, and everyone's at a different level. Everybody has different needs. And so based on their professional growth plans, we're able to meet those needs. So every teacher could be working on something different, and that's something that Dr. Fletcher is working on very hard for next year. Our district is going to be working on personalized professional learning for our teachers, and we're going to be able to count one day of PD or professional learning if we do a micro-credential. And so when teachers complete that, then that will be able to be counted as a day, and that has not been rolled out to our teachers yet, but that's something that we are working on this summer for next year. So I think it's really important for teachers to be able to choose, with our guidance as well, where they need the most work at. It's not a one-fits-all.
Sarah and I are from the same district, so we basically, the same comment on that also, but I've heard a lot of feedback about the autonomy and teachers having a voice this year, and the excitement of the personalized learning, not being made to go to the same PD as their peers because they feel the need for their own growth, and they know what they need based on their professional growth plan.
Similar comment. I think so often when we throw out words to teachers from administrative offices around differentiation, personalized learning, and student engagement, and we don't give our teachers a visual or an experience that they can own in order to replicate that, sometimes that's where we get frustration, and sometimes that's why teachers, choose that the profession may not be exactly what they're needing. So I definitely think to give our teachers the opportunity to experience this on their own will definitely help replicate that in the classroom. To me, the biggest difference is solely on demonstration of knowledge. So many times we have set through professional development opportunities, and we complete an evaluation at the end, and sometimes we put those things into practice, and sometimes we have a folder that may get put in a file, and that's not used in the future. So I think this is something that we can truly own, and that we can see things put into practice immediately, because when you invest that much time into an activity, you're going to have some buy-in and some value to that process to utilize it long term.
I will focus on two other points so that I'm not just being repetitive, but the first one I think is, for me, I really like the freedom within the micro-credentials on how you answer them. So I'm a writer by nature, I'm an English teacher, so I really like being able to write out my responses, and I like being able to look them over. I have coworkers who would prefer to video their responses.
I have others that might want to do some sort of a project. And a lot of the different micro-credentials give you different options for how to complete them, which I really appreciate. The other thing is, as somebody who's about to wrap up her 4th year in the classroom, as a young teacher, I don't have that work-life balance totally down yet. And I know that's something that I'll never totally get, but it's especially, I think, rough early on. And I like the freedom of being able to work on a micro-credential Monday night. Maybe I don't finish it on Tuesday because I have a basketball game I have to work. Come back to it on Thursday night, or work on during my planning, or work on it in the morning if I don't have early duty. For me, that's really beneficial because it gives me time to not only work on other things for my classroom, but also to be able to relax and reflect.
Well, I don't know if that's going to age you. I have seen a progression, and I see this just as the next step in that natural progression. 26 years ago, we would pedal the cart to Breathitt County from neighboring districts and attend 2-3 days of PD, which was sit and get. One size fits all. Everybody sat in the room, we all got the same topic, and we got our seat hours. I've seen it progress from there to being able to travel outside the district to something that pertains particularly to what you do during the day. I've seen that then progress to our professional learning communities and our learning cadres, where as a school, we chose a topic that we worked on. For example, this year it was formative assessments for us. Now I see it being, it's mine. I get to choose. And I'm like you, I like being able to, sit and work on that in my pajamas with a bag of popcorn to one side and a Diet Coke to the other. And it's what I want to work on, and it's what I need, perhaps, more so than what I want to work on. Whichever way it happens to be, that works out. And so I greatly enjoy that, and I think I see other teachers starting to enjoy that. And I'm on that older end. I'm one of those older teachers that you have to sort of hard sell on some of those things sometimes, because those are new for me, and I see the value in it, and my students see the value in it.
Guys, you all have done a wonderful job. We had one more question, but I feel like you all have actually talked about it already and answered the question about incentives and how that you drew people to micro-credentialing, or you were drawing yourself to it. So because we are running a little over, I'm not going to ask y'all to answer that because I do feel like you've already answered it, in all honesty. Yes, I'm going to turn this back over to Robert, and you all did a wonderful job, and thank you so much.
Superintendent has requested it. We'll tweet it out later.
Hey, Tina, turn your nameplate around. We don't.
Yeah. I said it was just a typo.
Thank you again, appreciate it. Thank you, Bernadette, so much for that. Okay, we're coming up to our final presentation for the day before we do a little bit of group activity. A lot of what the work that they've been speaking to is a result of the hard work of the person I'm getting ready to introduce to you. With her and her team, and she's going, and people out there going, because we all know how wonderful she's been working and how hard she's been working. But Jennifer Carroll is the personalized professional learning lead at the Kentucky Valley Educational Cooperative. She works as part of the team at KVEC to lead the Activated Catalytic Transformation Act, which supports schools in developing shared leadership capacity to identify systemic problem of practice and develop a collaborative theory of action that solves a challenge through a cycle of continuous improvement. Micro-credentials are one of the key work streams that ACT teams utilize, as you heard, in their systems of professional learning. And Jennifer has developed 4 micro-credentials for KVEC that are offered through Digital Promise. She has a Master's of Science degree at the University of Louisville, a Master of Arts degree from Morehead State University, and has pursued her doctorate at the University of the Cumberlands. Jennifer was Kentucky Social Studies Teacher of the Year in 2000 and was the president of the Kentucky Association of School Administrators in 2017. So please welcome Jennifer.
I'm like Gary.
Can you hear me? Is that okay? Okay, I'm like Gary. If I'd known that was going to be read out loud, it would have said something entirely different than that. I don't have pockets. I love dresses with pockets, but I'm just going to have to do the best that I can. And I'm going to go back and contradict something, because the work that I'm going to talk about today is not my work. It is the work of our entire cooperative, hence the word cooperative. And when I say that, I mean it's not only the work of the people who work directly for KVEC, but it is the work of our schools and our districts. The folks who came before this work and an iteration of the work that we call the Appalachian Leadership Lab, they really helped to shape the design of this work. And then the folks that I made sit up here at the table, because they look a lot better than me, so you all can look at them while I talk. They are doing some phenomenal work, and I just want to be able to share the work that's going on and share how micro-credentials are a component of this overall system. So we're not talking solely about micro-credentials, but we're talking about how we utilize micro-credentials as part of a school and staff transformational model that builds continuous improvement through reflective data analysis and shared leadership. So we're gonna talk really briefly about that, because I know it's been a long day and I feel like we've made it to the tribal council or something and everybody just barely hanging on. So I'm gonna try to make it short and sweet. So I do have a couple of objectives. But I first want to talk about just a brief overview of what we're talking about when we talk about ACT, because those girls, they all mentioned it, activating catalytic transformation. I want to make sure that everyone kind of understands what that is, but then explain how that currently supports systems of personalized professional learning, and then what our plans are for continued growth and improvement of that model. And then my other objective is just being able to connect with you all, because I don't know, I feel really inferior up here, because I think about all the people that are in this room and how highly I think of all of you all, and the fact that a lot of you have come up in my conversations frequently. Those of you who know me around micro-credentials know that I say a lot. Michelle Mills says, Michelle Mills recommends. So it's like really great that Michelle Mills is in this room. And then of course there's Jennifer and Odelia, who I reference like the gospel all the time when we talk about micro-credentialing. If you are entering into the world of micro-credentialing, I don't think you can do it without Jennifer and Odelia. They have been phenomenal working with them through Digital Promise, so it's really great to have them in the room. It's great to have those district administrators in the room who continue to want to have conversations with us about how do we shape district policy and practice to support personalized professional learning that includes micro-credentials. So just being able to connect with you guys is just a really wonderful opportunity today. So you see that beautiful mural up there over the registration table. That is not just a beautiful work of art, because that represents a lot of hard work that has come into play because of our director and our associate director, Dr. Jeff Hawkins and Dr. Desi Bowling. They were the recipients for the cooperative of a 2013 Race to the Top District Award. And that has enabled us to put a lot of supports in place for our schools and districts. So there are things going on around next generation learning, next generation classrooms, technology. The Holler grew out of that Race to the Top District Award. Professional action networks that we're working with our teachers around. There's just so many things that folks have been introduced to and had a part of because of that Race to the Top District grant. So the natural iteration of that work has been able to kind of look at how we funnel it all into a system. So folks are doing work that utilizes those supports to get to common goals and aims. And that is what activating catalytic transformation really is. So the vision of this work is to really build upon those strengths and that collective efficacy of our region, of those schools and districts and communities within our region, to identify those systemic problems of practice that we can work collaboratively to solve, and then look at how we can share those solutions across our region, across our state, across our nation. Because as educators, we like to share our solutions to those strategies so folks don't have to reinvent the wheel. That's the vision for the work. Jeff always says, and I won't get it exactly right because he has such a way with words, but he talks about the idea that there is not a problem that exists that the folks, the educators and the students in our region can't put their own good minds toward to solve. And that's really what ACT is. It's about how do we develop the capacity of our school teams to to solve their own problems and to share those solutions at a broader scale. I have a video here, so I hope it'll play.
When you have something that's good and it works and you're seeing the results, a lot of times you don't get to share that outside of your building or outside of your district.
One thing that I found very beneficial with the ACT program is it has really brought us together. But being a new principal, it has also helped us to open the networking up to other counties and districts and really helped us share ideas with other people.
It's given us an opportunity through our theory of practice to focus on student engagement and to bring training to our faculty and staff.
As far as the school goes, it's been amazing growth, but also for myself personally and professionally, going and networking with other administrators and other schools and seeing what's going on elsewhere, hearing each other's ideas and thoughts on things, helping each other problem solve and grow together as a group.
And being able to collaborate and network with the other people who were in the leadership laboratory. Literally, without that conversation, my classroom would not look the same.
You know, this year we've hit the surface, we've, introduced them, we've got our students and our teachers engaged with it and on board. And so next year I feel like we'll take a bigger leap.
We are definitely applying. We are more than excited, waiting on the application. We cannot wait to grow and learn with ACT. It's amazing.
It's really meeting every child's needs.
So this really wasn't a commercial to get you to apply because the applications have already been turned in, so sorry about that. But I just wanted you to be able to see the excitement and to see that shared leadership approach that really is about ACT. We did use that as a promotional video and it worked because we've increased our scope for next year tremendously, so that did work. This past year, we had 14 schools representing 8 districts as a part of the Activating Catalytic Transformation. That impacted 433 teachers and over 6,700 students. So that's a pretty big scope of work for this network. You had this on your table because I know you probably can see it because you probably have better eyes than I do, but I couldn't see this if I had to look at it from a seat. But this is sort of a graphic that kind of shows the continuous improvement model that is ACT. So I just want to talk really briefly about some of the steps. I really like the idea that it is an infinity loop because it does represent that continuous improvement process. But as you start with number 1, I think it's important to realize that the folks that are engaged in this work are engaged because they want to be engaged. We are not a regulatory agency. We don't require people to do anything. So the folks who have stepped up to be a part of this work do it because they want to. And I think you can tell by the panel that was there and those folks that mentioned that they were part of ACT, you can just sort of see something about the personality of those leaders that really want to be engaged in this project. So it is a commitment that is coordinated by the principals. We really view this as being not only student-centric, but principal-centric. And how do we develop the skills and the capacities of our principals to lead shared leadership work through their schools to solve this problem of practice? We provide facilitated coaching through reflective data analysis as we start this process so that when we actually do settle on a problem of practice, that it really is reflective of the root causes of the data, and we look at all of the data. So as I think Sarah mentioned, we're not just looking at state assessment data, we're not just looking at MAP data, we're looking at all of our data. We're looking at retention data, we're looking at behavior data, we're looking at student perception data, walkthrough data, all the data that we have to really dig in and find out what is that systemic problem of practice. And here's the rub, that can really best be solved by a shared leadership approach. Because we've all spent time in a school and we know that we could identify a host of problems of practice that a school could work on. But usually they're problems of practice that might impact a content area or might impact a grade level or might impact special education. But how do we really decide on that problem of practice that we're going to work together as a shared leadership team to solve, that has entry points for everyone in the building and even our community advocates who work with our schools to help us develop solutions? Then we move into developing 2 theories of action to help us to develop solutions to those problems that get to our desired long and short-term outcomes. And that theory, we have a school-wide theory of action, and we'll look at a template of that in a minute, but then also an individual theory of action, so that every person that is part of that team knows what it is they're responsible for to move that school toward those desired outcomes. Then we start looking at what we call our key work streams, and a piece of those is around facilitative coaching and networking and mentoring, and that's sort of what those next stages are, like 5, 6, 7, and 8, kind of work around that. So how do we provide, as a cooperative or with each other, how do we provide those personalized professional learning opportunities? How do we implement those personalized professional learning plans? What are the trainings that we need? What are the network meetings that we need? How do we work together to drive that theory of action? Facilitative coaching is not just KVEC coaching, it's how do we coach each other. We utilize something, folks from Kentucky are familiar with PEDAL, which is a process that was developed by Dr. Hawkins and Dr. Webb from Floyd County when he was superintendent in Floyd. It is a process that we call PEDAL, Perpetuating Excellence in Teaching, Leadership, and Learning. And it really gives school folks the opportunity to get into each other's buildings and help each other look at continuous improvement. So facilitative coaching can also happen through the PEDAL process. And then we kind of get to the point where we're looking at those waypoints. We're looking at video proofs through Firecast videos that schools develop. We're looking at their presentations at our summits. We haven't really talked about that today. And every year we have 2 really large educational summits, one in October, where teachers who've received innovation grants, but also our ACT schools, share their plans. They share their theory of action for what it is that they're going to do, for feedback from peers. So they actually get actionable feedback about, have you thought about this? Or there's some resources that you might want to consider in order to help them really make sure that their theory of action is as tight as it can be. And then they work through the year with the support from KVEC, with the support from each other, and then they come back in April to share the results. So those waypoints really help us to determine then what's next. Do we continue on with our same problem of practice because there's still room for growth, or can we move on to something else that we've identified as a need? They talked about the framing a problem of practice micro-credential. As we have engaged in this, as we started engaging in this work, we knew that we needed, because it's kind of a multifold approach with this micro-credential. For one, we needed a process and a protocol for folks to learn how to work together to have that shared leadership approach to defining that problem of practice that really is something that folks can work together to solve. But we thought if this is a micro-credential that teams could earn together, then that would sort of be the model for what is a micro-credential? How do we work on it? How do we submit video? How do we do all those things that we know could be roadblocks to success, so we kind of can support people through earning that first micro-credential. Also on your table, you have this template, which is actually our template for our theory of action that our schools work on. It's on the back side of your infinity loop, because you probably can't read all of those things. But after folks have identified their problem of practice, they start over here to identify what are those long-term impacts that we want to see on students that are really around expected outcomes, such as proficiency or graduation rate or student engagement rate, dropout reduction, contacts with parents, whatever. What are your long-term impacts? Then what are your short-term outcomes? What are those changes in behavior, attitudes, or practice that you want to see? And then from there, you back map what are the actions that each of these role groups need to take in order to get to those desired outcomes. So what is it that the teacher must do in order to get to those outcomes? What must the principal do to help the teacher get to those outcomes? The central office folks who support that school in an instructional capacity, what is it they need to do to support the principal, to support the teacher? Then what is it that our community partners and our community advocates can do? And then what are those inputs? Some of our schools added a column for students. So what is it our students can do? So very, very flexible. But I think it's important to note then that as we think about how KVEC is utilizing micro-credentials, our micro-credentials that we have developed come from this process. Because as people are identifying the steps that they have to take in order to get to those long and short-term outcomes, it usually involves professional learning. We need to improve our skills and our practices and our competencies. And that then is how we're developing the micro-credentials that we want to develop as an agency, so that it truly is aligned to their needs and it is going to help them to advance those desired student outcomes. Here are some examples of current problems of practice that we have. I think some of your roles is up there, but I don't know about my McGoffin County people if they're still here or not, but they may not made it to tribal council. The first one I think is just a really powerful one, and I got interviewed this morning out in the hallway, and I actually thought I was going to start crying over this one. I thought, gosh, get it together, girl. Menopause can't be that bad, but I guess it is. This one was just so powerful. We had a high school that really ended up, they had a hard time nailing down their problem of practice, but once they did, they really realized they found the right one. They were working with their teachers around increasing and improving parent communications. And you would think that that would not be something that folks really struggled with, but it was difficult. And they created an app that helps teachers. It has tools, it has protocols, it has questions, it has those things that teachers need when you sit down to make a phone call or have a meeting with a parent, things to make that meeting go better. But then they also realized that they were missing an important piece. That important piece around having that parent communication is having the student at the center. So they started to build in some more student supports. And one of the things that they did was they interviewed every student in their high school. And they asked those kids, who are the 3 people in this building who you feel a close connection to? And that if things are going bad, that's the person that you want to talk to. If you have a need, that's the person that you want to talk to. And they put that into a database so that those teachers could use that information. That's kind of telling. Because if you've been a classroom teacher before and you're looking through that database and you're not seeing your name pop up very much, you might do some self-reflection. Or if you're seeing your name pop up a whole lot, you might be thinking, okay, I'm doing something right anyway. But something that really had meaning around that was this past year, there were several students in that school who lost loved ones, parents, grandparents, siblings. I think there's 4 or 5 that had deaths in their family. And that school made sure that those 3 people that that child identified as their go-tos, that those are the ones that went to the funeral home. So could you imagine being a kid and you've lost someone very close to you, and you look at that door in the funeral home and there comes those 3 people who really mean something to you. So it's really working to build a culture. And I thought that was a pretty powerful piece. But this app with all those tools and strategies is an awesome tool, but now they are sharing that across the region so that people can tweak it and make it their own. Because it was for a high school, so how does that look different for an elementary school? Letting folks work to develop their own. Another school developed a intervention program that to me is pretty phenomenal because it is interventions that happen right there during the day when kids need it the most. They call it Greyhound Grit because their school mascot is a greyhound. And everyone works toward interventions. The principal teaches a class. Principal does an intervention class. Principal will not come out of his building. We know, we've tried to get him out of his building before. He will not come out of his building when it's time for Greyhound Grit or when he has class because it's that important to that school. Really tied to standards. The kids know what their learning targets are. They know if they're meeting them or not. They know how to get into Greyhound Grit, and some of them want to go to Greyhound Grit even though they've not been identified as needing Greyhound Grit. They just feel like, I want to get better at this, so I want to go. So a pretty powerful tool. We have another school in our network who only has 1 teacher per grade level. And they want to do PLCs, but it's kind of hard to do PLCs sitting there talking to yourself. So they try to create ways that they can have PLCs virtually, virtual networks, whatever, so that their teachers can also participate in professional learning communities. And then there were 3 Lawrence County schools that all had similar problems of practice around gradual release model, but the high school kind of had an aha moment. They've been working on gradual release for a couple of years, and they thought they were ready to bring in formative assessment with that. But in the meantime, while they've been doing gradual release, they've gone to a one-to-one model. And gradual release, the whole I do, we do, you do, looks different when you have technology in your classrooms. So they've backed up to look at how do we implement gradual release with technology. So do you all want to talk just for a second about what your all's problems of practice were? Sarah and Annie, you all talk about yours kind of together because yours was similar. Just kind of share what yours were.
Our problem of practice went into 2 phases, and so the first phase this year, or this past year, we're out of school now. Our first phase was, you gave me my microphone. Sorry, that doesn't. Our first phase was based on formative assessment and what formative assessment looked like during each phase of the gradual release. So we kind of created a bank for teachers, what formative assessments would it look like in the collaborative phase? What types of assessment it would look like in the focus phase. So we created a bank during PLCs, and our schools worked together a little bit just to kind of allow teachers of all levels to be introduced again to formative assessment. So this coming year, I think we're just going to look at diving deeper into instruction.
Next year, we'll incorporate the micro-credentials through the personalized learning, but also in phase 2, we're going to look at differentiation using the formative assessments that we've helped teachers learn. So just really using that assessment for learning and make an impact on student achievement.
At Allen Elementary, we focused on student engagement last year in our theory of action, and we obviously are going to continue that work. We're in the process of analyzing the data that we have for this school year, and we've made progress. Looking at when we look at walkthrough data and we look at benchmark data. But we set some pretty lofty goals. We wanted 100% engagement. We really want to meet every child's individual needs. So we feel like we still need to grow in those areas. So we're going to continue with student engagement, and this is going to be the micro-credentialing, learner engagement credential for all of our learning teams. So we're going to dive deeper into engagement learning and hopefully have an awesome impact on our school.
So as we look at the supports that KVEC and each school provides each other throughout this theory of action process, we have kind of coined the term the 5 key work streams, and there are descriptions of those also on your table. But as you look at the whole idea around clinical professional learning, there are other ways that professional learning can be clinical, be embedded in the classroom than just micro-credentials, and so we're exploring other avenues around that, such as lesson study, peer observations, professional action networks. We're really looking at other ways that clinical professional learning can occur. That facilitative coaching, we call it collaborative coaching for our micro-credential that Angela talked about, because this is a very different kind of coaching. This is coaching not in a supervisory role, not me telling you this is how you need to be better because I'm going to come back in a couple of weeks and evaluate you, but this is how we sit together as peers and really help each other to advance our own professional practice. So developing tools and supports that support that facilitated coaching. Networking networking just encompasses all of these. These overlap each other quite a bit, but networking just probably encompasses all of those, because when these teams get together, the conversations that they have are phenomenal, and the way that they help each other to improve and to flesh out what their real problem of practice is, to flesh out those theories of action, and then help each other wrap a system of supports around what is it that you need in order to get to your desired outcomes. The principals, the elementary principals, have formed a network where they meet, they organize it, they meet regularly. I think we met 5 times this past year, and KVEC next year, we are starting a principal cadre for all of the principals in our region, but I heard from one of those folks over there, I'm not going to name which one, but they were like, please don't take away our network that we're doing. It's like, don't worry, we're not. You can keep doing that. So it's really fun stuff. That idea around mentoring, about how do we help each other become better, kind of overlaps with the coaching, but then the micro-credentialing as a component of that as well. So these 5 key work streams are just really how we wrap the system of supports as an entire cooperative around these schools. Everybody on the KVEC staff know these schools, they know the teams, they know what their problem of practice is. They know what's in their theory of action, and they're helping to provide workshops and training and support to help those schools to get to their desired outcomes. Next week, we have an elementary math training based on some needs that these schools have identified, so really helping them to meet their needs. So this is how ACT is currently supporting personalized professional learning. So we are creating those data analysis tools and strategies for continuous improvement that help people to identify that problem of practice. We have the framing problem of practice micro-credential. The idea that a school develops a theory of action and then each person on that team identifies their own theory of action so that they really know what are those steps. You know, it's not 500 things I have to do, but what are those 3 or 4 things that I need to do as an individual that's going to help my school reach these goals. The facilitated coaching, the pedal visits, the networks, and then the micro-credential development and support are all ways that we are helping these schools to get to their goals. Robert mentioned at the beginning of the day that we have developed 4 micro-credentials, and they all were developed out of this work. So the framing a problem of practice one. Johnny Belcher works with our ACT schools as our assessment and accountability coach lead. You know, I don't know if your state's like ours, but we're still trying to figure out assessment. And
I can help you with that.
still trying, okay. We'll talk to you about that, Gary, for sure. But we knew that folks needed to not only know about assessment in terms of state assessment, but how do we really start to understand assessment for learning, balanced assessment, formative and summative assessment. So we have created, and you know, a lot of us who've been in Kentucky for a while, we've gone through quite a bit of training around assessment literacy. We've done the Rick Stiggins and Jan Shipley training. We've done those things. But we have a lot of new educators who haven't. You know, they didn't go through the whole big thick Castle book and know all those things that we know. So being able to create a micro-credential for those folks to help them get up to par around assessment literacy was very important. The collaborative coaching that works really great for Angela's team also works for our ACT team as they learn how to engage each other in collaborative conversation. And then the last one kind of spawned out of some specific work we were doing with some ACT high schools, but it is really a need across our region, across our state, is we have a lot of folks who are facilitating online computer science classes that are being offered through with curriculum from like CodeHS or Code.org. But these folks who are facilitating these classes, they are not necessarily computer science teachers grounded in that content area. So creating a micro-credential to help them facilitate that online course was pretty important. And then we have one more in the queue that stemmed out of some work that we've done with the Jim Knight group, and that is around the power of a checklist and the fact that with instructional strategies, being able to create a checklist so that you don't forget important components of that instructional strategy, that really stuck with a lot of folks as they did that work with us through our Renaissance Academies. So that is one that is actually in development now. So how do we plan to continue to improve personalized professional learning systems? And if you have suggestions for continued improvement, we would love to have conversations with you about it. We want to continue some of the pieces that we have already in place because we really firmly believe that that problem of practice and theory of action approach is the right one for that shared leadership team to come together around that problem of practice. We want to provide support to our districts and our schools in thinking about policy around micro-credentialing, because we still are having conversations with folks about how do you award CD credits, how do you award hours for micro-credentials, or how do you create district supports for micro-credentialing. So being able to continue to have those conversations with our district administrators is important. We want to move toward, we've had that conversation today a couple of times around effective assessment. So we want to move toward assessor networks, because as we assess these micro-credentials and we see the strengths that those earners display, we really feel like those people would be the ones to give better, actionable feedback to potential earners. So using supports, we want to be able to create those assessor networks. Creating those cross-district and cross-school micro-credential earner networks. It will be really easy to do in our ACT work, but thinking as a region about how do we connect educators who are working on common micro-credentials with each other so they don't have those challenges that, like Michelle brought up, around the video submission or about feeling like the Lone Ranger as you're working on this by yourself. So how do we create those communities, not just within a school, but cross district and cross school? And then also helping schools and districts be able to create their own micro-credentials because we think they're really awesome examples of competency-based learning and helping folks to understand what that looks like. So as we look ahead, and you saw our apply now, we've already gone through our application process for this coming school year, and we have actually increased our participation to 17 schools representing 10 districts. That takes our numbers up to 585 teachers and almost 9,000 students. But I think another powerful, fun piece of this work is through partnerships that we've made through other work, through our Race to the Top District grant, through work that we've done with the National Rural Ed Association. We have folks from other states who want to partner and become part of this ACT work and implement components of the ACT work. And truthfully, micro-credentials were a big selling point of that work. So we have folks from the Galt Joint Unified Elementary School District. They are here with us today, and we have been having regular meetings and virtual conversations, and we even got to visit Galt, and they've been able to visit here to look at ways that they can become members of our ACT network. And so for next year, we will have at least one school from Galt who is part of our ACT network, and then a district in Tennessee, Polk County Schools, is also interested in becoming part of our work. They are in one of the schools that they're going to involve is in the process of hiring a principal. So we're not going to talk about which school it is yet because we're not going to scare her off before she gets hired. The last is just a way for you, if you want more information about what's going on with ACT, if you want to see the firecast of our schools. I think Sarah did a firecast, Anna, you did a firecast. You didn't, Sarah did a firecast. Rachel did a firecast. You can see videos about the work that's going on in their schools on theholler.org. I want to mention Cassandra Akers because I said earlier when we got started, this was actually a team work. I couldn't make a single day go by without Cassandra. She is new to our team, but we've worked with her in the past. She was a principal at Betsy Lane High School, and those of you who kind of have followed KVEC know that Bill and Melinda Gates made a visit to our region, and they showed up on her doorstep, and she let them in. So Bill and Melinda toured her school. Melinda Gates actually made the statement that she wished that she could lift Betsy Lane up and put it down in any other school, because she really felt it was that powerful of an example of what high school should look like. And I am a forever Cassandra Akers fan, and she is working with our community engagement component of this work. So as you look at that community column, how do we get communities engaged in helping schools to implement these theories of action? And then the last thing is purely selfish, because that is my Twitter account, and Jeff and I sort of have this, it's kind of died down for him, I think, but not for me, a contest about who can have the most Twitter followers, and I am 27 behind him right now. So if 27 of you all could follow me but not him, that would help me immensely. Okay, so that is how we can connect through Twitter. Sorry, Jeff, I've got to beat you somehow. Somehow I've got to beat you. But I would love to connect with you guys over Twitter, because that is really our ACT Twitter account where we really share the work that's going on in our ACT schools. So it'll be a great way to connect with you all. So I'm going to stop because I've been trying to make that time as fast as I could. If you have questions for me or really questions for the experts, we would love to take those.
As we end up today, you'll see on the wall several charts. Okay, there's several questions on the wall representing some charts that represent the questions on the board. What I would like you to do for the next 5 minutes, and the facilitators I had coming in here, I appreciate your waiting, but as time kind of messed up, if you could go back out as we do this to work with our folks. You have Post-it notes in your buckets. So if you can look at a question or two that your table is very interested in responding. We want to hear from you about ways for networking and continue this work as we push this out farther. For example, we are planning on hosting this event again next year, but over a day and a half. Because as the first time we did this, we had 50 people. This time we had over 120 people. And as more conversations occur, and just talking with some today, more folks want to come. So we're looking at making it larger, but also interested in co-hosting for folks who would like to host with us and maybe in the future make this a roaming summit in different places across the states as we continue with these conversations. So if you wouldn't mind, for the next, let's go ahead and do 6 minutes since I talked for a little bit here. Look at those questions, and on Post-it notes, please talk to each other and then get these up on the walls as you find the questions. It would have been smart for me to have put the questions in the order they're on up here, but I didn't realize I didn't do that after I looked at the wall and went, oh, but you'll find them. Okay. All right, so, and go.